It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC 24G2SPU or 24G2SP depending on your region. As usual, what you see in the video depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor looks like firsthand. As usual, there is a written review, which this video is a part of, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Just be aware that in this video I do give examples, mainly in-game examples, a few on the desktop, but what I'm talking about here, in areas such as contrast, colour reproduction for example, they apply more broadly than just games. This monitor uses a 23.8 inch Full HD, that's 1920 by 1080 or 1080p resolution, IPS type panel from Panda, or more specifically an FFS panel, which stands for Fringe Field Switching. So in terms of its multitasking potential, productivity, not really a lot going on for it there. Full HD resolution is really very restrictive in that respect, but you can still use it for that kind of thing, technically use it on the side for that kind of thing, but if you're spending a lot of time doing productivity, then you may find it a little bit restrictive in that respect. The pixel density itself isn't particularly high either. Of course it's higher than the 27-inch Full HD monitor, but it isn't as high as a 2560 by 1440 model, which is 27 inches. It's similar to a 32-inch WQHD model though. So it's not a terrible pixel density by any means, it's reasonable. It gives you a reasonable level of detail and clarity. Of course, this one is really designed as a budget monitor, it's very well priced. And also the Full HD resolution is relatively easy to drive, and actually a lot of video content still is focused on this resolution as well. So it certainly will make sense for some people. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So the monitor has a plasticky construction. It's reasonably solid actually for a budget offering. You can also see it's mainly dark matte plastic, although this is the U variant. The non-U variant has a silver coloured stand base, so just be aware of that slight aesthetic difference there. They both have this, it's almost sort of a dark metallic effect red plastic. It tends to look brighter than it is in videos and pictures of the monitor. It's actually quite a dark red, and I find it blends in fairly well, or better than you might expect based on photos and videos of the monitor. There's also the little lip at the bottom of the bottom bezel, same kind of thing. The stand offers full ergonomic flexibility. You can see the exact adjustments in the features and aesthetics section of the written review. And the stand itself is quite compact as well. It doesn't take up a lot of depth on the desk, which is nice. The screen has a dual stage bezel design, which is very common on modern monitors these days. And that means that it has a panel border around the image. It's kind of difficult to see when the monitor is switched off, but when it's switched on, you will be able to see that panel border around the image. It's just part of the design, and again, it's very common, and it has a slim, hard plastic outer part. But the panel border on this one's actually very slim. Again, you'll see that when the monitor is switched on, so the total bezel area is quite slender on this. The screen surface is medium matte anti-glare or regular matte anti-glare. That means that you don't really have to worry about sharp glare patches or reflections. So this is when there's quite strong direct light hitting the screen. You will see that it diffuses that quite heavily. Sometimes when I show you at this kind of angle and similar lighting with other reviews with lighter matte anti-glare screen surfaces, you might be able to sort of see sharper patches of glare with more distinct details. So because of this stronger diffusion, it does mean that strong direct light can still be an issue because it can flood the image. You ideally want to avoid that if you can. And it also means that the light emitted from the monitor is diffused more heavily, and I explore that a little bit later. At the rear, you'll see the red and black theme continued. So it has these little dark metallic effect red plastic elements there, mainly matte black plastic though. The stand attaches centrally with a quick release mechanism, so if you push that little switch up there, then you can detach the included stand from the screen, and that reveals 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. There's also a little hexagonal cable tidy loop in the centre of the stand towards the bottom. And there's a K slot there, I'll just mention that before I forget it. Again, this is the U model, so the 24G2SPU rather than the 24G2SP. In terms of the performance that I talk about in most of the review, it's very much the same between the two models, but the differences really come from the ports and some of the features. So The U model has integrated speakers. They're not particularly good speakers. If you don't have the U model, you're not really missing out too much there, but you can use them if you need to, if you've got the U model. The other thing with the U model is it has those USB ports. They're USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, so basically USB 3 ports. There's also a yellow coloured one that supports fast charging, so there are 4 of those, plus upstream. You don't get any USB on the non-U model. The rest of the ports are the same though. They face downwards. There are 2 HDMI ports, DisplayPort 1.2A, D-sub, VGA, your analog connection. There is a 3.5mm audio input and a 3.5mm headphone jack. And then there is an AC power input, which means this monitor has an internal power converter rather than an external power brick. So just quickly, in terms of the capabilities of the ports, the full 165Hz refresh rate at the native Full HD resolution, that's supported via DisplayPort. With HDMI, you will be limited to 144Hz maximum. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate, in the form of adaptive sync, and you can use that as an NVIDIA user via DisplayPort with G-Sync compatible mode, and as an AMD user using AMD FreeSync via DisplayPort or HDMI. Although I don't have an Intel system to use, they can use adaptive sync as well. If you've got compatible Intel graphics hardware, you should be able to use adaptive sync via DisplayPort as well. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor uses an IPS panel, an IPS type panel, so contrast isn't its main strength. Having said that, it is actually relatively strong for an IPS type panel. In that respect, I measured 1300 to 1 under my test settings. I measured 1337 to 1 out of the box at 100% brightness. I'm sure some of you will appreciate that figure. And depending on the settings used, I measured just a little bit below 1500 to 1. So these readings are just a touch lower than I measured on the old 24G2U, but the overall experience is very similar. And that is to say that it doesn't give you an incredible depth and atmosphere. This still isn't an amazing contrast ratio if you compare it to a VA model. For example, they could be 2 to 3 or perhaps more times as high as this. And certainly compared to an OLED, it doesn't give you that kind of experience at all. I'm sitting in a dark room at the moment, and this content being displayed is mixed but largely dark, and there's plenty of darker content on this game, on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so it doesn't have a deep and atmospheric look, although it's certainly better in that respect than some IPS models. You'll also be able to see IPS glow. This is exaggerated somewhat on the video, certainly based on my camera's preview screen that I'm looking at the moment. But it does create this sort of haze which blooms out from the corners of the screen. It tends to be a bit more noticeable towards the bottom corners to the eye because you tend, from an ergonomically correct viewing position, you'll be sitting a little bit above centre. And it's also something which can be brought out more strongly if you're using a higher brightness setting on the monitor, if you're sitting closer to the monitor, or if your monitor has issues with backlight bleed or clouding. That can also bring it out more strongly. But it's certainly there, certainly a feature. If you've used IPS models before, you'll be very much aware of this. It's at a moderate level on this model, perhaps slightly lower than average, although that might be just because of the generally stronger than average contrast. I've brightened things up a bit, as in I've brightened the room up a bit. I'm not sitting in a pitch black room anymore. The reason I like to do this is just to talk a little bit about the effect of room lighting on your perceived contrast, because it certainly does have an effect. So it's not a particularly bright day at the moment. It is moderately bright. So it's just enough to enhance the perceived contrast and draw your eyes away from those weaknesses which I highlighted before. So the IPS glow is a lot less noticeable now, it's still there a bit, and the weaknesses in static contrast are less apparent as well. If you brighten the room up too much or you've got strong direct light hitting the screen surface, then you can also have issues with glare. It's not too bad in this room at the moment. I do have a little bit of glare on the screen, but the main issue would come if you're in a particularly bright room, and especially if you have direct light hitting the screen surface, because that's going to be diffused across this medium matte anti-glare screen surface, and it's going to really flood the image. So I just want to make you aware of this. If you do like to sit in a dimmer room, which I completely understand, then perhaps at least consider having some lighting behind the monitor, bias lighting or that kind of thing. It can really help with perceived contrast, even if the rest of the room isn't particularly bright. This IPS type panel has excellent gamma consistency, so that means some of these fine details, I'm afraid they're pretty difficult to capture on the video in an accurate way, but I can see the bricks here, little texture details like that. They're very consistent throughout the screen. You don't get what you get on a TN model where you get the sort of gradient of detail vertically, and you don't get what you get on a VA model where you have things looking too masked centrally and not masked enough peripherally. Things are instead displayed appropriately throughout the screen. Of course, there is some detail loss because of the IPS glow, but overall the consistency is better than TN or VA models in terms of the gamma handling. When observing brighter shades, I like to talk about the screen surface, and this monitor has a medium matte anti-glare screen surface, so it does have some layering in front of the image. It doesn't allow the same kind of direct emission of light, or the relatively direct emission of light that some matte screen surfaces and certainly glossy screen surfaces can provide. Another attribute of the screen surface to consider is how grainy it looks, and that's not always related to how strong it is. So this is a medium matte surface, but that doesn't automatically mean it's going to be super grainy, because this one isn't. And actually in that respect, it's better than many competing models. It's certainly better than competing TN models I've used, and it's better than the 24.5-inch models, which use the AU Optronics panel. In terms of its graininess, the image does look a fair bit smoother than that. So if you're sensitive to grainy screen surfaces, this model can be quite good in that respect. I'm now on lagom.nl, and the test for viewing angles. This is a good way of exploring the idea of colour consistency. And the lagom text here looks blended grey throughout the screen, a little bit of dark red striping towards the bottom. I should also note that the background, the grey background, there are some slight inconsistencies here related to the uniformity of my unit, but they appear greatly exaggerated on the video. For example, it doesn't look like there's a sort of really dirty look towards the edges, as I can see on the preview screen. To the eye, it doesn't look like that at all. The shifts are far more subtle than that. But anyway, in terms of the striping of the text, this indicates a relatively low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd hope for from an IPS type model. The purple block always appears weird on the video, but to the eye it's quite a consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen. There's a bit of a stronger pink hue towards the edges of the screen, particularly the side edges. The red block, that appears fairly consistent. It doesn't have as much darkening towards the edges of the screen as I saw on the predecessor to this model. My unit did have quite a few uniformity issues, the older model I looked at, so that could contribute here, but they both use a Panda panel, and I would say that based on what I've seen at least, it does seem that some improvements have been made to the panel itself to make it a bit better in terms of overall colour consistency. I wouldn't say it's as strong as some IPS models in this respect, but I do think it's stronger than the older model. The green block, that's a good consistent green chartreuse throughout the screen. Towards the very edges of the screen, it's a brighter yellow. This may be partly because of the panel design. It has very slender bezels at the top and sides, which can actually pinch a little bit. This isn't unique to this model at all. It's a dual stage design, and that can contribute to this kind of thing. The blue block, that appears good consistent royal blue throughout the screen. Again, if I look towards the very edges, it is a bit brighter there in that region. And again, I think this is a characteristic of how the panel is put together and the design there. And just a final thing to be aware of for this section before I move on to the gameplay. When I talk about some of these inconsistencies, for example, things becoming pinker towards the edges of the screen, a little bit of dulling of the red, those kind of things, they can be more exaggerated if you're sitting close to the screen as well. So I sit around 70 centimeters from the screen. If you're sitting closer, then some of these shifts can be a little bit exaggerated. But either way, the colour consistency here is significantly stronger than you see on a TN or VA model, and I certainly do feel that it is improved compared to the predecessor to this model. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So again, you get that fairly good colour consistency, so you have saturation levels maintained well throughout the screen, better than you'd get on TN or VA models, so less of a reduction in saturation towards the edges of the screen, that kind of thing. Another thing to consider is the colour gamut. So this monitor's colour gamut extends quite a bit beyond sRGB, and for content like this, games, and just when you're casually browsing the internet, watching things on Netflix, on YouTube, most of that content is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if the colour gamut of the monitor extends beyond sRGB, it invites extra vibrancy, extra saturation, beyond what the developers or creators of the content intend. So I'm just going to flash up the gamut I recorded for this one on the screen. So you can see there a fair bit of extension beyond sRGB, 92% DCI-P3 coverage, so it's not a super wide gamut by any means, but certainly enough extension beyond sRGB to invite some oversaturation or extra saturation and vibrancy, depending on how you want to look at it. As you noticed in the green region, there was quite a bit of extension, and that does bring out some of these greens in quite a noticeable way, so they got some extra pop to them. Yellowish greens are brought out a bit too strongly. None of these sort of natural greens look neon, that's not how I describe them, and you might get that kind of look on a monitor with much wider Adobe RGB coverage. If you're interested in that side of things, check out the written review. For those interested, I recorded 85% Adobe RGB on this one, so there's quite a bit of undercoverage of the Adobe RGB gamut, but that's fine, it's not really going for that at all. The reddish browns of the earth here, the red's brought out too strongly, it doesn't look as much of a neutral brown as it should. It doesn't go as far as looking like a sort of Martian landscape or anything like that. But just in general, there is extra saturation vibrancy. The sky blues as well, they get a little bit of extra vibrancy, but not a strong extra dose there. So overall, it's a look which many people will quite like. It's not strongly oversaturated, just a bit of extra vibrancy, extra saturation. But I appreciate some people prefer things to look more as the developers intend, even if that intention is with the quite restrictive sRGB color space in mind. And if that is you, if you do prefer that kind of look, then the monitor does offer an sRGB emulation setting. You switch color temp over to sRGB. Unfortunately, that locks the color channels. It unlocks your gamma control, but more importantly, I'm getting shot at. No, more importantly, it locks your brightness control. It's locked at 90 brightness, which on this model is rather bright. You can see the exact measurements in the written review, but if I recall correctly, that would be well over 300 nits. So this is actually a lot brighter than most people would want to use. That alone makes this setting completely unusable, but it does clamp the gamut, so it does tone down that extra saturation. Things look more as the developers intend in that respect. If you are a PC user and you wish to have sRGB emulation on this monitor, I would instead look at the GPU side options, which are discussed in the color reproduction section of the written review. So if you're using an NVIDIA or AMD GPU, that's something you can do if you're using desktop GPUs from each vendor, and that works very well to clamp the gamut without restricting your brightness or other controls of the monitor. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate, so that means the monitor is able to output up to 2.75 times as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. So this brings with it two main advantages. One is it greatly improves the connected feel. That describes the fluidity and the precision when you're interacting with the game world. In that respect, it also helps if the monitor has low input lag. Unfortunately, this model does. I measured under 3.5 milliseconds, and that indicates a good low signal delay, which most users should be absolutely fine with. And that's the main element of input lag you feel. The other advantage of this high refresh rate, high frame rate combination is that it greatly reduces perceived blur due to eye movement. Perceived blur is a concept which is explored in some detail in an article on the website all about responsiveness, and it's also summarised in the written review, where that article is also linked to in the responsiveness section there. So if you're not familiar with this concept, please do a little bit of background reading on that. It will be helpful. I also discuss pursuit photography, which is a nice method of capturing perceived blur on a monitor, not just due to eye movement, but also due to pixel responses. So I'm just going to flash up some pursuit photographs from this monitor running at 165Hz on the screen with various different overdrive or pixel response time settings used as well. So with this, you can see that the performance isn't perfect, but it's still pretty good. It doesn't have any massive weaknesses. You don't get the kind of smeary trailing that you get on VA models. There are also some IPS models which are slower than this one as well. But if you look at the dark background, which was the top row, even using the strongest pixel overdrive setting, there were some weaknesses in terms of what I would call powdery trailing. And it does mainly focus on those transitions where there are darker shades involved. So there's some of them here in this scene. The darker brickwork there against the background. I can see some of this powdery trailing there as well. And just in general, there is a little bit of a mask of powdery trailing in places, which does add a bit of perceived blur. So when I look at the brickwork there, for example, the finer texture details in general, there's just a little bit of that. But it's not a massive amount. It's not something which most people are going to find bothersome. It's not something which everyone's necessarily going to notice at all. In terms of the overdrive settings, I actually prefer to use medium, and I've got the monitor using that at the moment. If you do up it to strong, and this is personal preference, you might prefer that, but to me, strong doesn't really do much to decrease the perceived blur. It makes some slight improvements to pixel response times for some transitions, but the main weaknesses remain there in much the same way, but then overshoot becomes more of an issue. So with the medium setting, there is a bit of overshoot in places, so a little bit of trailing which is slightly brighter than the background, for example. So that can stand out just a little bit. It's a little bit brighter. It's called halo trailing. But with the strong setting, that becomes a lot more noticeable. So I'm just going to switch over to the strong setting, see if I can capture some of this on the video. So I can see this quite noticeably towards the left of these blocks here with the sand in the background. There's halo trailing, which is brighter than the sand, and I find it quite eye-catching, but sensitivity to this does vary. It's not super strong overshoot, so do feel free to use or experiment with the strong setting, but I don't think you lose much by using medium, and this overshoot is certainly a lot weaker there with the medium setting. There's also some around the makeshift roof here. Kind of colourful, bright flashes. You won't necessarily see it in the video. Also with the darker shades there, there's almost a sort of blue trailing, which isn't there with medium. Moving on now to a different scene on Battlefield 5. This one has a lot of darker shades, so it looks at these high contrast transitions, or transitions involving darker shades against somewhat brighter and significantly brighter shades, which IPS models like this do struggle with a bit, or sometimes struggle with a bit. And this one, just in general, it's not too bad. It really isn't. These sort of weaknesses, yes, I can pick them up. I spend a lot of time looking at monitors and reviewing them, so I can certainly notice these weaknesses. If you are sensitive to this kind of thing, you may pick them up. Otherwise, for most people, they're not really going to be an issue. So there's a little bit of this powdery trailing. So for the makeshift roof there, for example, and just in general, again, there's a slight mask of perceived blur, but there aren't really distinct weaknesses like you'd see on VA models or even some weaker IPS performers. So I think at this point it would be nice to just draw some quick comparisons. And if you look at the responsiveness section of the Vision review, I actually have some pursuit photograph comparisons at 144 Hz and below at least, with some alternatives to this monitor. The reason that they're 144 Hz and below is simply because those models I tested would only run at a maximum of 144 Hz. And just in case you're curious, I do have this monitor running at 165 frames a second, so I'm making the most out of the 165 Hz refresh rate as well. You can see my frame rate in the top right there, 165, that little green number. So yes, the comparisons I compared to the predecessor of this model, the 24G2U, or the 24G2, depending on your region, and also the Acer XB253QGP. So the predecessor to this model first, that was using its strong overdrive setting, but with this very monitor, using its medium overdrive setting even, it's actually a little bit stronger in terms of its acceleration levels than the predecessor using its strong setting. So that's actually quite a good thing. They seem to have pushed the pixel responses just a little bit more. Not a dramatic difference, but it is nice that they've done a little bit of work there. And as for the Acer, that uses the 24.5-inch AUO, AU Optronics panel and AHVA panel, and that is a natively faster panel than this one, and that really does perform very well, particularly at 144 Hz. So there isn't as much powdery trailing. It does have a little bit in places for some transitions. It's not perfect, but it really is very fast as far as IPS models go. And also the BenQ EX2510S, that uses an AU Optronics panel as well with similar kind of pixel response attributes. So if you're really into your competitive gaming, and that's really a key focus for you, you might find that those models are better suited to you than this AOC, but for most people, and that includes if you do a bit of competitive gaming, you should hopefully find this AOC just fine because it doesn't have distinct weaknesses, it still performs well. The monitor also supports adaptive sync, that allows you to use AMD FreeSync as an AMD user, and also allows you to use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. This monitor is actually G-Sync compatible certified by NVIDIA, which means they've done certain quality checks to it, make sure it works as it should under VRR, variable refresh rate operation, using G-Sync compatible mode. And I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3090 just at the moment, and it did work very well. Also tested with an AMD GPU using FreeSync, and it gives a very similar experience on both. There are no particular issues to note, no issues I had with flickering or anything like that, or strange stuttering which shouldn't be there. So the technologies do work very well on this monitor, the VRR technologies. And what these do for you is when the frame rate drops below the refresh rate, as it has done now. I've got the game running at 120 frames a second at the moment. If I had the monitor stuck at 165 Hz, I'd have a mismatch between the frame and refresh rate. And if I had VSync disabled, I would get obvious, or obvious to me, obvious to sensitive users, tearing. If I had VSync enabled, I would get obvious, again obvious to me, sensitive users, stuttering from these mismatches. So with the monitor instead dynamically adjusting its refresh rate to match this frame rate, you don't get those interruptions. And that's very nice to have if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. But with this drop in frame rate, there is a bit of your connected feel, which is lost, and also there's an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. But in terms of the pixel responses, I'd say at 120 frames a second, the monitor does very well. Again, there's a little bit of powder trailing in places, there are some slight weaknesses, but the pixel response requirements for optimal performance here are actually lower as well than they were at 165 frames a second. So the weaknesses are also a little bit less pronounced. And again, if you look at the pursuit photographs in the written review, they're taken at various different refresh rates. That will give you a good frame of reference there. And I'm again using my preferred medium setting. The overshoot levels are just fine here, in my opinion. A little bit of overshoot, a little bit more than there was at 165 Hz, but nothing dramatic. And if you happen to be preferring to use the strong setting, that works pretty well here as well. It doesn't have extreme overshoot at this kind of refresh rate either. I'm now running the game at 90 frames a second. I'm still using my medium setting, my preferred medium setting. What I would say is that now the overshoot is becoming quite eye-catching. And just to give a very broad recommendation, of course it's subjective, people have their own preferences, just a broad recommendation, if you are spending a lot of time with double-digit frame rates, so you're below 100, or even just slightly peaking above 100, I would actually recommend switching over to the weak setting. I'm not sure if this comes across on the video, but just for reference, I can see significant halo trailing around the tree there and around the flag post. Just going to switch over to weak now. And that's gone. So yes, the pixel responses are slackened off a bit, but at these sort of double-digit frame rates, the weak setting's still reasonable. It doesn't really give you a huge drop-off in your performance, a huge drop-off in pixel response times. So if you are spending a lot of time in a mixed environment or a lot of time in your double-digit frame rates, I would just recommend sticking to the weak setting, really. The game's now running at 60 frames a second, using the weak setting still. No real issues with overshoot. A little bit creeping in now in places. If you're using medium, then that becomes rather eye-catching. Hopefully this will come across on the video. Rather strong overshoot. I'm not even going to show you the strong setting, but it does actually ramp this up further and makes it even more eye-catching. So again, stick to weak if you're at such low refresh rates. If you're not using VRR, by the way, it doesn't matter what your frame rate's doing. It's not going to give you extra overshoot. It's just that this monitor doesn't use variable overdrive, so it doesn't retune its pixel overdrive as your refresh rate dips. But it is to do with the refresh rates rather than just the frame rates. And with this model, the variable refresh rate range, the VRR range, is 48 to 165 Hz. If your game dips below 48 frames a second, then it uses LFC, low frame rate compensation. This works on both the AMD and the NVIDIA side. This means that the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. And that also keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. There is a slight sort of hiccup, if you like, very slight stuttering. Not everyone's going to even notice this. Very slight stuttering when that boundary is crossed in either direction. So if you're frequently passing this boundary, that could potentially be bothersome. Just something to be aware of. Finally, this monitor does include a strobe backlight setting called MBR, motion blur reduction. That can't be used at the same time as VRR, but you can use it on its own if you wish. And that's explored in detail in the written review. That's a much better format for exploring this kind of thing. In videos, all you see is obnoxious flickering. In the video, you can't see any of the benefits of the strobe backlight setting, so it's really not a nice way of going through it. But certainly do check out the review. It's explored in the contrast and brightness section, it's explored in the responsiveness section, it even is explored subjectively with its own little sort of subsection of the responsiveness section. So absolutely check that out. There are pursuit photographs as well. If you are interested in strobe backlight settings, this one, I'd say it's sort of reasonable, it's usable, but it's not the best I've used. It's not the cleanest performance out there, but I've certainly seen worse as well. To wrap up then, in terms of the styling of the monitor, I think it's more agreeable than you might think from the photos if you're not a big fan of red, bright red, because it's not bright red, it's sort of dark metallic effect red, not as eye-catching as you might think. Other than that, plenty of matte black plastics, slender dual stage panel design, and good ergonomic flexibility with the stand as well. So in my view, a pretty decent design overall. 24-ish inch screen and full HD resolution. Not incredible pixel density, not incredible amount of useful desktop real estate for productivity, that kind of thing, but a relatively easy resolution to drive. In terms of contrast, the monitor offers a performance which is actually quite strong for the panel type, but again, it's not incredible in that respect. Even though it is strong for the panel type, it's not really saying an awful lot. It doesn't give you the same kind of experience that you get from a VA model, certainly not from an OLED, but it's still nice to see a relatively strong performance for the panel type in that respect. IPS glow as well, moderate amount of that, maybe a little bit lower than average, but still certainly a feature. The screen surface, medium matte anti-glare, so a little bit of layering in front of the image, but it did at least have a relatively smooth finish. It doesn't have the level of graininess which many competing models with the 24.5-inch AU Optronics panels, or in fact any competing TN model I'm aware of, they give a significantly grainy look to lighter shades. The colour performance, you get a nice dose of extra vibrancy from the colour gamut. It extends a fair bit beyond sRGB, 92% DCI-P3, so that gives extra vibrancy, extra saturation, a look which many people will quite like. It's not for everyone, and if it's not for you, you can use sRGB emulation. Unfortunately, the sRGB emulation mode of the monitor itself is pretty useless because it locks you at such a high brightness level. Unless you happen to like that kind of high brightness level, it's really going to be unusable for that reason alone. It's also restrictive in terms of locking off your color channels and your gamma control, that kind of thing. For responsiveness, good VRR performance, didn't have any unexpected flickering or any kind of unexpected stuttering that shouldn't be there. Worked well with both the AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, so AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, both working much as I'd expect, much as I'd hope. The monitor has quite a low level of input lag as well, so that's good. And the pixel responses, they're not class leading, but they are perfectly decent. Does a decent job in that respect, certainly much better than any competing VA model of this kind of class, and better than some IPS models as well. And actually, I would say edges out the predecessor just a little bit in that respect as well. And not just because it has a slightly higher refresh rate, which, by the way, is kind of a nice bonus, but nothing revolutionary. So overall, I think this is a very well-priced monitor. I do think it offers some improvements from its predecessor. I feel that they've just slightly tweaked the pixel response, as I mentioned. I also felt that the colour consistency was better. Again, it's not class leading when it comes to colour consistency. The AU Optronics 24.5-inch models, a little bit better in that respect. But again, it was nice to see improvements in this area compared to its predecessor. And it's certainly, compared to a TN or VA model, much better performance from the AOC here. So yeah, definitely a monitor I can recommend. I think it's very well priced, good all-round performance from it, and if you're in the market for this kind of monitor, certainly one that I'd recommend trying out. So that's really all there is to the AOC 24G2SPU or 24G2SP, depending on your region. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.